The story of how the modern world learned to measure itself is, on the surface, a clean one. Governments grew. Trade expanded. And as complexity increased, so did the need for systems. Census records, land surveys, tax registers, demographic tables. The explanation is logical. It is tidy. And for most of history, it holds together reasonably well. Until you look at the numbers. Not the conclusions drawn from the numbers themselves. Specifically, when they appear, how complete they are, and what kind of institutional capacity would have been required to produce them at the moment they were produced. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions, but the questions are worth sitting with. In 1086, William the Conqueror commissioned what would become known as the Domesday Book, an exhaustive survey of England covering land ownership, livestock, population, taxation liability, and resource allocation across nearly every settlement in the country. Historians describe it as a remarkable administrative achievement, a feat of organizational will. And it is, without question, an impressive document. Here is what makes it uncomfortable. The survey covered approximately 13,418 settlements. It recorded the names of landholders before and after the Norman conquest, the number of plows on each estate, the number of villagers, smallholders, slaves, and freemen. It calculated not just present value but past value, what each estate was worth before 1066, and projected future taxable potential. This was completed in approximately 1 year. The country did not have a professional civil service. It did not have a centralized administrative bureaucracy. It did not have standardized paper, printing, or rapid communication infrastructure. The logistics of coordinating teams of commissioners across regional circuits, reconciling conflicting land claims, resolving disputes, and producing a unified document, all within 12 months, represents a level of organized data collection that most historians describe as extraordinary. What they describe less frequently is the question of precedent. Where did the methodology come from? A survey of this precision at this scale does not emerge from nothing. Someone designed the question framework. Someone standardized the recording format. Someone decided what categories mattered, and that decision reflects an existing mental model of how a territory should be quantified. A mental model, in other words, that already existed before the survey began. Move forward roughly 2 centuries. In 1337, France began what would become one of the earliest systematic attempts at national demographic accounting. Tax registers, known as hearth taxes or feuilles, attempted to count not individuals but households, using the hearth as a proxy unit of economic presence. The records are fragmentary, but the ones that survive are strikingly structured. Each entry follows the same format. Each region uses the same categorical logic. The classification system, distinguishing between taxable and exempt households, between rural and urban properties, between clergy, nobility, and commoners, is applied with a consistency that implies coordination. The question researchers occasionally raise is not whether these records were kept. They clearly were. The question is, how were the keepers of these records trained? What reference system did they work from? And where, in the available historical record, is the documented transition? The moment when someone sat down, designed this classification framework, and transmitted it to scribes and regional administrators across a fragmented feudal territory with no centralized communication system. That documentation, in most cases, does not clearly exist. This pattern, of statistical infrastructure appearing without a legible origin, becomes more pronounced as you move into the 15th and 16th centuries. In 1427, the city-state of Florence conducted what historians regard as one of the most sophisticated fiscal surveys of the pre-modern world, the catasto. It assessed the wealth of approximately 60,000 households across Florence and its subject territories. It recorded real property, movable assets, business investments, and outstanding debts. It calculated net taxable wealth by subtracting liabilities from gross assets. A conceptual operation that requires not just arithmetic literacy but a formalized accounting framework. The catasto produced over 1,000 volumes of records. The city of Florence in 1427 had a population of roughly 40,000 people. The administrative apparatus required to design, coordinate, execute, record, and store a survey of this complexity, relative to the city's total human and institutional capacity, is difficult to map using the tools historians typically rely on. The survey did not fail. It did not produce inconsistent results or collapse under its own weight. It was completed, organized, and used for subsequent taxation. What preceded it, in terms of formal training, standardized methodology, or institutional memory, remains, at best, a subject of scholarly inference. Scale mismatches of this kind are not unusual in the pre-industrial record. They appear with notable frequency in contexts where the explanatory infrastructure, the story of how a system was developed, trained, and deployed, is thinner than the system itself. In the Ottoman Empire, detailed provincial surveys known as Tahrir defters were conducted from the early 15th century onward. They recorded villages, population estimates, agricultural output, and tax obligations across territories spanning 3 continents. The methodology was consistent. The categorical logic was standardized. The surveys were updated at intervals that imply ongoing administrative maintenance. Historians note the sophistication. They note the scale. What receives less attention is the rate of methodological maturity, the speed at which a system in a given region moves from absence to full operational deployment without an obvious intermediate period of institutional development. In most modern organizational contexts, large-scale data collection systems require years of design iteration, pilot programs, training, error correction, and refinement. The historical record in many of these cases does not show that intermediate layer. What it shows is the finished system. None of this is, in itself, conclusive. Administrative history is fragmentary by nature. Documents are lost. Transitional records are rarely preserved with the same care as formal outputs. And historians who specialize in these periods would, correctly, point to a range of contextual factors that help explain these achievements. But there is a difference between an explanation that accounts for a pattern and an explanation that simply notes the pattern is not unprecedented. The mismatch here is not small. It is not isolated to one region, one period, or one type of record. It appears across tax surveys, land registers, demographic counts, and resource inventories, in Western Europe, in the Ottoman world, in contexts that are geographically and politically disconnected. Some of these systems were measuring a world that, by most accounts, had not yet developed the institutional foundations required to build them. And the question that follows from that observation is one that the records themselves do not cleanly answer. The discomfort intensifies when you stop examining cases individually. Because when you map these patterns across regions that were not connected, that did not share administrative traditions, did not communicate systematically, and in some cases were not even aware of each other's bureaucratic frameworks, what you find is not a series of isolated achievements. What you find is a recurrence. The same structural signature, appearing in disconnected places, at roughly comparable stages of claimed institutional development. And nowhere is that recurrence more legible than in the 19th century United States. By 1850, the United States federal census had already moved beyond a simple head count. The 1850 census was the first to record information on every free individual by name, not just the head of household. It captured age, sex, race, occupation, value of real estate owned, birthplace, whether the individual had married within the year, whether they attended school, whether they were literate, and whether they suffered from specific disabilities including blindness, deafness, and what the records term insanity. The country in 1850 had no national identity document system, no centralized population registry, no standardized municipal record-keeping infrastructure outside of a handful of major cities. Large portions of the enumerated territory were frontier regions with no permanent administrative presence. The census was conducted by approximately 3,500 assistant marshals working independently across 23 states and several territories. They used a standardized form. They applied consistent categorical definitions. They returned data that was then compiled into published statistical volumes covering population distribution, occupational breakdowns, agricultural output, and manufacturing capacity, by county, by state, and in aggregate. The methodology was not approximate. It was not impressionistic. It was structured data collection at national scale, using a classification system detailed enough to distinguish between 47 separate occupational categories. In 1850, 13 years later, in the middle of a civil war, the United States conducted another census, not a population census but an agricultural one. The 1860 and 1870 agricultural schedules recorded, farm by farm, the number of improved and unimproved acres, the cash value of the farm, the value of farming implements and machinery, the number and value of livestock by species, and the quantity, in bushels, pounds, or gallons, of every major crop produced in the preceding year. This was not a sample survey. It was an attempted enumeration of every agricultural operation in the country. The United States in 1870 had approximately 2.6 million farms. The data collected from those farms was processed by hand, tabulated by hand, and published in volumes that ran to thousands of pages. The statistical methodology applied to that data, the weighting, the regional aggregation, the per capita calculations, reflects a level of quantitative literacy in the administrative apparatus that sits in a peculiar relationship with the documented state of American higher education at the time. In 1870, there were fewer than 600 colleges and universities in the entire country. Formal training in statistics as a discipline barely existed. The American Statistical Association had been founded only in 1839. And yet the output of the census system, its internal consistency, its methodological sophistication, its operational scale, reflects institutional capacity that the documented educational and administrative history of the country struggles to fully account for. The United Kingdom presents a parallel set of observations, with its own distinct texture. The General Register Office, established in 1837, began systematic civil registration of births, marriages, and deaths across England and Wales. Within its first decade, it had produced actuarial life tables detailed enough to support the modern insurance industry. By 1851, the census under Registrar General George Graham had introduced occupational classification schemes that researchers still use as reference frameworks today. What is worth examining is not the existence of this system. It is the speed of its maturity. From establishment to full operational sophistication took, in institutional terms, almost no time. The transitional period, the phase during which a new administrative body would be expected to make errors, revise its methodology, struggle with definitional inconsistencies, and gradually improve its outputs, is, in the British case, strikingly compressed. The first published outputs of the General Register Office read like the work of an institution with decades of accumulated methodological experience. The categorical frameworks are stable. The analytical approaches are confident. The statistical commentary in the annual reports reflects not a system learning how to measure, but a system that already knows. Some historians attribute this to the influence of specific individuals, William Farr in particular, whose work at the GRO is credited with establishing the methodological foundations of modern epidemiological statistics. Farr's contributions are real and documented. But the question of where an individual acquires the conceptual framework to design a national statistical system, as opposed to contributing to one that already exists, is a question that biographical accounts tend to move past quickly. Infrastructure before demand is a phrase that appears occasionally in economic history, usually in the context of railways or telegraph systems built ahead of the commercial activity that would eventually justify them. It describes a pattern where the capacity precedes the need that supposedly generated it. In statistical systems, this pattern is harder to see because the infrastructure is institutional rather than physical. But it is present in the record. The United States had a dedicated National Statistical Bureau, the precursor to what would become multiple federal agencies, before it had a national banking system. It had standardized land measurement frameworks before it had fully surveyed the territory those frameworks were designed to measure. It had occupational classification systems detailed enough to track industrial labor before the industrial labor force they described had fully formed. In the United Kingdom, actuarial tables precise enough to anchor life insurance calculations were produced from mortality data that, by modern standards, was incompletely collected. The sophistication of the analytical output does not match the known quality of the input data. Some layer of methodological infrastructure, appears to be bridging that gap. What that layer is and where it came from is not always clearly documented. Taken region by region, these observations invite contextual explanations. Taken together, across disconnected political systems, across different centuries, across territories with no direct administrative lineage, they begin to suggest something that contextual explanations address less comfortably. Not a conspiracy, not a claim. Something closer to a structural question. Whether these systems were developed independently, inherited from earlier frameworks, or reflect something in the documented record that has not been fully examined, that question does not have a clean answer in the sources currently available. Some researchers, when mapping these patterns across regions and time periods, have begun grouping them under a broader interpretive label. A label that the next part of this examination will address directly. Not because the word is dangerous, not because it carries legal or political weight, but because it has accumulated, over the past decade of internet discourse, a set of associations that make it almost impossible to use neutrally. It arrives preloaded. It arrives with conclusions already attached. And for that reason, any serious examination of what the label actually represents, as distinct from what its most vocal proponents claim it represents, requires a degree of deliberate separation that most discussions of this topic do not attempt. The word is Tartaria, or, more precisely, the interpretive framework that has come to organize itself around that word. In its most historically grounded form, Tartaria, sometimes spelled Tataria, refers to a geographic designation used extensively in European cartography from roughly the 13th through the 18th centuries. On maps produced during this period, large portions of Central Asia, Siberia, and extending in some versions across into Eastern Europe, were labeled as Tartaria or Great Tartaria. The label was not, in mainstream historical understanding, the name of a unified political empire. It was a cartographic convention, a way of designating territories that were, from the perspective of Western European mapmakers, imprecisely known, loosely administered, and populated by groups that did not fit neatly into the sovereign categories European cartography was designed to represent. This is the documented, archival, academically uncontested origin of the term. What happened to that term in the early 21st century is a separate phenomenon. Beginning roughly around 2017 and accelerating through the early 2020s, a body of online interpretive content began using the Tartaria label to organize a much broader set of claims about architectural anomalies, about the origins of 19th century building styles, about unexplained infrastructure, and, relevantly for this examination, about the origins of administrative and statistical systems that appeared, in the view of these researchers, more sophisticated than the historical record could cleanly explain. The framework, in its popular form, proposes that a civilization or administrative order of significant scale existed prior to the period Western history designates as modernity, and that the systems, buildings, and organizational structures attributed to the 18th and 19th centuries were not built from scratch but inherited, repurposed, or retroactively attributed. It is important to be precise about what this video is and is not doing with that framework. This examination does not endorse the Tartaria framework as historical fact. It does not present the statistical anomalies documented in the previous sections as proof of a prior civilization. It does not suggest that mainstream historians are engaged in deliberate misrepresentation. What it does is note that the Tartaria interpretive label, whatever its limitations, is functioning for a growing number of researchers and independent historians as a container for observations that existing academic frameworks have not yet produced satisfying explanations for. That is a different thing from the label being correct. But it is also a different thing from the label being meaningless. Some researchers who engage seriously with these questions, including those who do not endorse the broader Tartaria framework, have noted that the history of statistics as a discipline contains genuine unresolved questions about the speed of methodological development. The standard historiography of quantification, associated with scholars like Ian Hacking and Theodore Porter, documents the emergence of statistical thinking as a gradual process rooted in specific intellectual and political conditions. Hacking's work on the avalanche of printed numbers in the 19th century and Porter's examination of the social history of quantification both provide rigorous frameworks for understanding why statistical systems developed when they did. What those frameworks are less equipped to address is the specific pattern this examination has traced, not the existence of statistical systems, but their apparent operational maturity at the moment of their documented emergence. The question is not whether census taking happened. It is whether the gap between the documented institutional inputs and the observed outputs is fully explained by the existing historiography. One interpretation, the mainstream one, is that it is. That the gaps in the record are artifacts of incomplete archival survival, and that the transitional phases of institutional development existed but were not systematically preserved. A second interpretation, less mainstream but not without scholarly adjacency, is that some of these systems may have had methodological precursors that are not currently integrated into the dominant historical narrative. That certain administrative frameworks were transmitted, adapted, or carried forward from earlier organizational contexts in ways that the surviving documentation does not fully illuminate. A third interpretation, the one the Tartaria framework represents in its most structured form, goes further, suggesting that the precursor systems were not merely earlier but were fundamentally different in kind, products of an organizational order whose scope and nature have not been adequately accounted for in conventional historical timelines. These three interpretations are not equally supported by available evidence, but they are not equally examined either. What makes the statistical dimension of this discussion distinctive, as compared to the architectural or infrastructural dimensions more commonly associated with Tartaria discourse, is the nature of the evidence involved. Buildings can be misattributed. Construction dates can be uncertain. Architectural styles can persist or be revived. These are domains where interpretive ambiguity is almost inherent to the evidence itself. Statistical records are different. They are dated. They are often internally consistent. They reference external events that can be independently verified. When a census record from 1850 captures 47 occupational categories and returns results with a degree of internal coherence that implies a functioning quality control methodology, that is not an ambiguous artifact. It is a document with specific implications about the institutional capacity that produced it. And the question of whether that institutional capacity is fully explained by the documented history of the organization that produced it is, in principle, an answerable question. It is a question of archival research, of institutional history, of the kind of slow, detailed scholarly work that does not attract large audiences but that occasionally produces findings that require existing frameworks to be adjusted. That work, in this specific domain, has not been comprehensively done. The Tartaria label, for all its accumulated noise, may ultimately be less important than the questions it has caused certain researchers to ask. Labels organize attention.